And, CRT has, like I mentioned earlier, it's been a discussion, argument point in some church communities, usually white evangelical communities. There's been things like, people listing the pros, listing the cons, some saying it's entirely incompatible with the gospel, some people saying it's completely compatible. What's really at stake in those kinds of conversations and arguments going on within some church communities?
Yeah, so I want to highlight 5 things that I think are at stake. Here's the first one. It's a matter of neighbor love. So how we interact with our critical race theorist neighbors, the extent to which we engage them justly, is a matter of how well we're going to love them. And I want to say we have to ask this question: are we loving our critical race theory neighbors in our interactions with them and their scholarship? And a lot of times, I'm going to be blunt, the answer is no. And this is even from those who might advocate in some senses for critical race theory, but they don't make extended stays in the scholarship. They talk without knowing much. And often it causes so much harm. So I think in these cases, one of the things we have to see is if we're not really doing due diligence, really giving our critical race theorist neighbors what they're owed, what we owe them, then we're likely to be in sin against them and against God. So I see this as a matter of neighbor love and therefore also a question of whether we're in sin or not. The second thing I want to say is we can miss out on an opportunity to learn about how U.S. law and legal institutions maintain forms and have maintained forms of white supremacy, white normativity, oppression, and subordination along racialized lines. So even if we don't end up agreeing with everything that critical race theorists teach, and by the way, not all critical race theorists agree. This is one of the things I'm trying to highlight. There's a lot of difference of opinion. If we don't engage justly and lovingly with them, then we're going to miss out on opportunities to learn about the insights that they have to teach us. So I often talk about the importance of taking a posture of humility and one of teachability. So I'm coming with expectations when I'm reading my critical race theorist neighbors. I'm wondering, well, what are the things that you have to teach me that you're seeing that I'm not yet seeing? And in particular, what are those things about U.S. laws that you're seeing that I haven't seen? Now I want to get into something that's hard, and this is the third thing. That is the ways in which people are discussing CRT. You had mentioned earlier, Brother Timothy, about how it's seen as a boogeyman or a boogie woman. Like I think, in part, the phrase is getting thrown around without much understanding and in a way that's causing extreme division. So again, whether or not you're going to agree with everything that any individual critical race theorist teaches, that's something that you'd have to figure out as you're working through it. But because of how little engagement people are giving to critical race theory and how they're using it in some ways like the Red Scare of Marxism back in the earlier 20th century, it's becoming a hyper divisive thing, and you're seeing this, frankly, especially in the Southern Baptist Convention, where there are now just this week multiple churches that are predominantly African Americans that are leaving, and it's not so much because they're saying, yeah, we really understand critical race theory, we're completely with critical race theory, but largely they're saying, if you're not even going to give this movement its due diligence as it's trying to offer helpful resources to understand systemic racism, what are we talking about when we're saying that we're really against racism in terms of the SBC making a stand against racism? So I think the discussions, especially because of how poorly they're being held, are fostering a lot of division. And let's be honest, it's racialized division. It's typically, as you had mentioned earlier, those that are most against critical race theory, whether they know much about it or not, are going to be racialized white, not exclusively, of course, but for the most part. And then those that are more hopeful about the potential that critical race theory as a movement is going to have insights are going to be racialized minorities. So there's a racial division. And unfortunately, a lot of the divisions are playing out in denominations that still have not really worked through their very racist histories. The other thing I want to note is we're missing an opportunity, in some ways picking back up on point 2 about understanding how U.S. law works. We're missing an opportunity to broaden understanding of sins of omission. So what are the ways in which, for example, we could learn from critical race theorists about how forms of Christianity in Jim and Jane Crow and Juan and Juanita Crow era, how can we learn about how forms of Christianity really just got constructed so that they were compatible with those forms of racial apartheid? So how can we learn about all these sins of omission? How can we learn from our critical race theorists, brothers and sisters, about how this even happened. What kinds of theories, what kinds of ways of seeing, what kind of practices have to be up and running so that you can have people who are proclaiming the name of Christ, who are saying we need to be against oppression, also saying, okay, I want the help. You got to be over there. No, you got to swim in your pool, not in the white pool, et cetera, et cetera. You got to ask these sorts of questions. And again, I don't want to, I'm not just talking about sins of commission, where we're actively doing things. But what are the ways in which we fail to promote forms of just, merciful, loving anti-racism? And the last thing I want to say is connected to that. We need to take an opportunity to learn from our critical race theorist neighbors so that we can deepen our understanding of church and therefore family history.